The morning sun rose gently over London, casting a golden light on the historic streets that led to Buckingham Palace. Tourists from around the world had gathered, each with their own reasons. Some came for the photographs, others for the chance to witness the famous changing of the guard, and many simply wanted to say they had stood outside the palace gates. The crowd was filled with the buzz of different languages, the shuffle of feet and the sound of camera shutters clicking nonstop. Among the respectful crowd was a group of visitors who didn't fully understand the importance of the place they were in. They laughed loudly, talked over the announcements, and behaved as though they were at a casual park rather than a royal site. Buckingham Palace has always been one of the most guarded and symbolic locations in the world. The Royal Guard, dressed in their striking red tunics and tall black bearskin hats, are a symbol of honor and tradition. They are trained to remain still, calm and expressionless no matter what happens around them. This discipline has fascinated people for generations. Many tourists test their patience by trying to make them laugh or react, not realizing that these soldiers are not actors but men on serious duty. Their responsibility is to protect the monarchy, and they take that job with absolute seriousness. The guards are not there for entertainment. They are there for security and respect, and next to them stand the majestic horses, strong, elegant, and trained to handle even the loudest crowds. The horses represent centuries of royal tradition as well. On that day, the respectful silence that usually fills the space in front of the palace was broken by the careless group. They pushed each other forward, laughed as they took exaggerated selfies, and even pretended to march like the guards. At first, the rest of the crowd tried to ignore them, but the disrespect began to draw attention. Some people shook their heads, others whispered disapproving words, and a few even raised their phones to record what was happening. The group thought it was funny, not realizing that hundreds of eyes were watching their behavior with disapproval. They wanted to create a moment for themselves, but what they were creating was a lesson they had not expected. The palace horses stood tall and majestic, their dark coats shining under the sunlight, their reins held firmly by the guards. Their discipline was remarkable. Even with the constant noise of tourists, they stood steady, eyes focused, ears twitching only slightly. They were trained to remain calm. But they were also sensitive animals who could sense energy, movement, and disrespect around them. One of the tourists, perhaps the boldest of the group, decided to cross the rope barrier. With a playful grin, he stepped closer than he was allowed, holding his phone high above his head as though this would make his picture more impressive. Gasps rose from the crowd. Everyone knew it was against the rules, but he ignored the invisible line of respect that most people never dared to cross. The air felt different in that moment. What had been light laughter suddenly turned into nervous silence. The horse nearest to the tourist shifted its weight, stomping one hoof on the ground with a heavy thud. It was a warning sign, but the tourist didn't understand it. He laughed again, waving his free hand as if the animal was part of a circus show. The guard holding the reins kept his body steady, eyes forward, but his voice broke the air like thunder. "Stand back!" The sharp, firm command carried through the square, silencing much of the noise. Still, the tourist only laughed louder, turning to his friends as though he had won a small victory by getting a reaction. He didn't see the seriousness in the guard's warning. He didn't realize that the line between patience and discipline had already been crossed. Around him, the other visitors grew uncomfortable. Parents pulled their children closer, whispering reminders not to copy the man's actions. Some people muttered under their breath about respect. Others shook their heads, disappointed that someone would treat such a historic place like a playground. Phones continued to record because everyone sensed something was about to happen. They had seen tourists before act silly, but this time it felt different. This time the tension in the air was heavy, like a rope pulled so tight that it was ready to snap. And in the center of it stood one man, his laughter growing weaker as he realized the horse's breathing had changed. The guard's grip on the reins had tightened, and the crowd's mood had shifted against him. The horse snorted loudly, its breath misting in the cool air. It raised its head higher, its eyes locked forward with the dignity only such royal animals carry. For centuries, horses like this had been part of parades, battles, and ceremonies. They were not trained to be toys for tourists, and they knew when someone crossed the line. The guard didn't move his eyes, but his body spoke of control and readiness. The careless tourist suddenly looked less confident. His laughter wavered, and for the first time he seemed to notice the seriousness of the situation. Still, his friends pushed him on, encouraging him to wave again for the camera. What they didn't realize was that the guard and horse were no longer tolerating their game. They were giving warnings, and those warnings were about to become unforgettable. For those standing nearby, it was like watching a story unfold in slow motion. The laughter of one group had turned into discomfort for the rest of the crowd. People could feel the respect of history hanging in the air. They understood what the tourists did not. This place was not only guarded by men in uniforms and majestic animals, it was guarded by centuries of tradition and discipline, and when that discipline was tested, there were consequences. The careless group had stepped into a lesson that would soon be remembered not only by themselves, but by thousands around the world once the recording spread. That first step over the barrier was not just a step closer to a horse, it was a step into a reality check. The morning continued to shine brightly over the palace, but the mood was no longer light. Every sound seemed louder. The shuffle of boots, the clink of reins, the steady breathing of the horses. The group that had thought themselves funny were about to learn the hard way that Buckingham Palace was not a stage for their amusement. It was a place of respect, and those who forgot that often found themselves in the middle of a story they would not forget. The crowd waited, breath held as the careless tourist lingered too close to the guard's horse. It was only a matter of seconds before everything changed. The crowd outside Buckingham Palace was still buzzing with quiet whispers after the guard's sharp command, but the group of tourists didn't take the warning seriously. Instead of stepping back, they laughed again, trying to hide the nervousness that was now clear on their faces. To them, it still felt like a joke. They thought the guards were actors playing a role and that the horses were just well-trained animals that would never move beyond a stomp. What they didn't understand was that both the guards and the horses had a job to do. This wasn't a street performance. It was an active post of honor and security. The horses stood in silence, but their movements began to show signs of irritation. One horse flicked its tail sharply, its hooves pressing harder against the cobblestones. Another tossed its head, the bridle clinking against the metal bit as if giving a warning of its own. Anyone familiar with horses could see the signals immediately. They were uneasy. But to the untrained eyes of the tourists, these were still just amusing reactions for their cameras. The boldest among them raised his phone again, zooming in on the horse's face as if it was nothing more than a background prop. His friend pulled out a small flag he had bought from a souvenir stand nearby. With a mischievous grin, he waved it right in front of the horse's nose. The reaction was swift. The horse let out a deep snort, stepping forward with a sudden force that made the air shake. Its powerful body shifted closer to the barrier, sending the tourist stumbling back in shock. The guard didn't flinch. His eyes remained straight ahead, but his voice, strong and steady, cut through the crowd. "Do not touch the horse. Step back now." The tone carried the weight of years of training. It wasn't loud or angry, but it was filled with authority that left no room for questions. Yet the group, trying to save face, burst into laughter again, though this time it was forced. Their laughter didn't echo with confidence, it cracked with unease. The rest of the crowd grew restless. Parents shook their heads, some covering their children's eyes and telling them to focus on the palace rather than the scene. A couple of elderly visitors whispered to each other, reminding those around them that the guards were soldiers, not entertainers. Many held up their phones, but not for fun anymore. Now they were recording what seemed to be a tense situation about to spiral further. A tourist from another country leaned over and muttered, "This will not end well for them," in a worried tone. Everyone else felt the same. The energy had shifted. The air was heavy, and the sound of every hoof striking the ground felt like a countdown to something bigger. The group of tourists still didn't see the seriousness. They wanted attention, and now they had it. They waved at the crowd as if they were performers, joking that they were braver than anyone else. They didn't notice how the guard's posture had changed slightly, more alert and ready. The horse's ears twitched back and forth, following every movement, every careless sound. The tourists were too caught up in their own laughter to realize that they had already crossed not just one boundary, but many. Boundaries of respect, safety, and tradition. One man in the crowd, a local who had visited the palace many times before, stepped forward and called out, "Oi, leave it, those horses aren't here for you." His voice was frustrated, echoing what everyone else was feeling. The group only laughed louder, mocking his warning too. But their laughter wasn't as full as before. It cracked under the weight of nervous energy. They could feel the eyes of the crowd turning colder, the atmosphere pressing down on them. Still, pride pushed them forward. They didn't want to back down in front of the cameras. They wanted to look bold, even though fear was starting to creep in. The horse that had been teased the most suddenly stomped both front hooves, the sound echoing across the courtyard like a drum beat. The tourist holding the flag froze for a second. The horse's large, dark eyes locked forward, steady and strong. It was a warning no one could misunderstand. The guard, still silent except for his steady breathing, shifted his grip on the reins ever so slightly, ready to control the powerful animal if needed. But even with the guard's steady hand, the horse's energy was undeniable. It was not there to be mocked, and it was not about to tolerate being treated like a toy. The crowd gasped again, and this time the group of tourists hesitated. Their hands lowered slightly, and their laughter grew quieter. But pride made one of them speak. "What? It's just a horse. They won't do anything." His voice was shaky, not nearly as confident as before. His words didn't convince anyone, not even himself. The horse let out another sharp snort, shaking its head, and the sound of the bridle rang through the square. For the first time, the boldest tourist stepped back without meaning to, his body betraying the fear he was trying so hard to hide. The people watching could feel the lesson building. This wasn't just about rules. It was about respect. The guards and horses weren't ornaments in a museum. They were living, breathing symbols of centuries-old tradition. The soldiers standing there weren't actors hired to stay silent. They were trained professionals serving their country. The tourists had mistaken silence for weakness, but they were now beginning to understand the truth. Silence was discipline. Stillness was strength. And when that strength was tested, the response would be unforgettable. As the minutes passed, the group began to lose their audience. The crowd that had once chuckled at their antics now turned their phones on them with a different energy. Instead of cheering them on, they were recording to capture proof of their foolishness. The tourists didn't realize yet, but their faces, their actions, and their arrogance were being saved on countless screens. Soon the world would see, and once the world saw, their laughter would not sound the same anymore. It would be replayed, criticized, and remembered for all the wrong reasons. The horses stood tall again, their breathing steady, but the edge of tension lingered in the air. The guards didn't move, but their presence was heavier now, a silent wall of discipline. The tourists stood frozen, not yet ready to admit defeat, but no longer bold enough to step closer. The situation was fragile, like a glass ready to shatter. One wrong move, one more act of disrespect, and the reaction would be swift. The crowd waited, the air still as everyone wondered. Would the tourists finally realize their mistake? Or would the guards and horses have to show them the consequences of crossing the line? The square in front of Buckingham Palace was silent now, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, the kind of silence where every person can feel that something is about to happen. The tourists, who had been laughing just moments ago, were now standing stiff, caught in the tension they had created themselves. Their smiles looked weak, their laughter had dried up, and all that remained was the sound of their quick breathing mixed with the heavy stomp of the horse's hooves. The atmosphere had changed completely. The horse, the same one that had been teased with the small flag, lifted its head high and let out a deep neigh that echoed across the stone walls. It wasn't just a sound, it was a statement. The power in the animal's voice sent a shiver through the crowd. Cameras clicked rapidly, recording every second, because this was no longer a playful scene. It was a moment people would remember. The guard holding the reins stood like a statue, his face unshaken, but even in his stillness his authority was clear. His grip tightened slightly, and his body leaned with subtle control, ready to handle the strength of the horse. Then, in a sudden movement, the horse jerked forward, its massive body shifting with force. The tourist who had waved the flag panicked, stumbling backward so quickly that his phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the stones. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and many people pulled out their phones to capture the exact second the joke had turned against the jokers. The guard's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Stand back!" His tone was louder this time, sharper, leaving no space for anyone to misunderstand. It was not a request, it was a command. The careless group froze, their arrogance finally cracking. The friend who had been laughing the loudest looked pale now, his hand shaking as he reached to help the one who had dropped his phone. The once confident group suddenly looked like children caught in the middle of a classroom scolding. Their bravado had vanished. Behind them, the crowd was silent, but their eyes told the story. There was no sympathy for the tourists. No one rushed to help them. Instead, people watched, some even relieved that the guards had finally given a strong warning. It was clear, to everyone except the group themselves, that they had crossed too many lines. The horses were restless now. The second horse beside the first tossed its head and stomped, its steel shoes striking the stone with sharp, ringing sounds. Both animals seemed to react together, as though united in their warning. Their muscles rippled, their powerful bodies moving with energy that could not be ignored. The crowd stood further back, some pulling children closer, making sure they were safe. The tension in the air was so thick that it was almost visible. The tourists tried to play it cool again, but the fear was written across their faces. One of them muttered nervously, it's fine, they can't do anything." But even his voice shook, and it was clear he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. The horse's heavy breath puffed out into the air, its nostrils flaring, its eyes flashing. No one believed the tourists' words anymore. Everyone knew the truth. The animals were not toys and the guards were not actors. They were living symbols of discipline and respect, and their patience was almost gone. One older woman in the crowd whispered to her husband, "They should have listened the first time." Her husband nodded silently, eyes fixed on the guards. People around them nodded too. It was no longer about entertainment. This was about respect for tradition, respect for the guards, and respect for the animals. Those who came to admire the ceremony understood it. Those who came to mock were learning the hard way. The boldest tourist bent down to grab his phone from the ground, but the guard's voice stopped him mid-action. "Leave it." The words were sharp and final. The tourist froze, his hand hovering just above the phone. He looked up at the guard, but the soldier's eyes never moved. He stared straight ahead as if carved from stone. Yet the authority in his presence made it clear this was not the moment to argue, not the moment to test patience again. The tourist slowly pulled his hand back, straightened up, and stepped behind the barrier. His pride was crumbling, and the crowd could see it. But the scene wasn't over yet. Another member of the group, perhaps trying to save face, smirked and muttered something under his breath. He lifted his phone again to record himself near the horses, thinking he could turn the situation into a funny video later. The moment he raised his hand, the second horse stomped forward with force, shaking its mane. The sound of the reins rattling through the air. The crowd let out a loud gasp, and the tourist nearly dropped his phone again. The guard beside the horse took one sharp step forward, his boots striking the stones in perfect rhythm. Without turning his head, he repeated the command, "Stand back." This time there was no laughter. The tourists' faces drained of color. The message was clear. One more act of disrespect, and they would face consequences they could never laugh off. The guards were disciplined, but they were not powerless. Their role was not to smile for pictures. It was to protect, to maintain dignity, and to ensure the respect of one of the most important landmarks in the world. The air felt charged, every second stretching longer than the last. The tourists finally lowered their phones, their voices quiet now. They looked at each other with embarrassment, realizing they had become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Behind them, people were recording everything. The flag waving, the horse stomping, the guard's thunderous command. These recordings would soon travel far beyond the palace gates. The group had wanted to create content for themselves, but they had unknowingly created a lesson for millions who would later watch. For the crowd, the moment felt almost satisfying. They had watched disrespect. They had seen warnings ignored, and now they saw order restored. They admired the guard's control, the horse's strength, and the discipline that never broke, even under mockery. The guards had not shouted or argued. They had simply stood firm, and their presence had been enough to turn the situation completely. The tourists shifted uncomfortably, trying to melt back into the crowd, but it was too late. Their actions had been noticed, recorded, and judged. They had tested tradition and discipline, and they had lost. The horse's sudden movement and the guard's commanding voice had stripped away their false confidence. The lesson was written on their faces, and though they tried to hide it, everyone could see the truth. The crowd didn't laugh with them anymore. They only stared. The moment passed slowly, but when it did, The energy in the air remained heavy. The guards stood tall. The horses returned to calmness. But the memory of the warning stayed with everyone who had seen it. The tourists finally stepped back, red-faced and silent, their earlier arrogance now completely gone. The square was quiet, once again, but this time it was a silence of respect. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something important. Not just a warning from the guards, but a reminder of discipline, tradition, and the power of respect. Two guards broke formation. Their black boots struck the stones with sharp, perfect rhythm. Every step echoed in the silence, and the sound alone was enough to make the crowd straighten their posture. People could feel the power in that disciplined march. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't loud, it was precise. The kind of movement that speaks without words. The guards moved like a wall of authority, their faces expressionless, their focus unshaken. They didn't need to yell. Their presence was enough to demand respect. The group of tourists, who only minutes earlier had been laughing, now looked nervous. Their laughter had died, replaced by awkward smiles and shuffling feet. They had thought they were untouchable because the guards always stood so still. They thought no one would move, no one would react. But now, seeing the guards step forward with discipline, their confidence melted away. The flag that had been waved so boldly earlier was now stuffed hastily into a pocket. Phones that had been raised for jokes were lowered, as if the tourists were hoping they could undo what had already been seen by everyone around them. The guards stopped directly in front of the group. Their voices came together, calm but sharp. "Move back behind the barrier." The command was not a suggestion. It was steady, direct, and final. The tourists didn't dare argue. Their shoulders dropped, and slowly, with embarrassment burning on their faces, they shuffled backward. Each step they took felt like a silent admission that they had gone too far. The crowd responded instantly. A ripple of soft clapping spread across the square. It wasn't a loud applause, but it carried meaning. It was a way of saying thank you to the guards, a way of supporting the discipline that had been shown. Parents smiled and nodded to their children as if to remind them, this is what respect looks like. The guards didn't react to the clapping. Their eyes stayed forward, their duty unchanged. They weren't there for praise, they were there for order. The horses, too, seemed to sense the shift. The one that had stomped earlier now stood tall again, its breathing calm but strong. Its mane rippled slightly in the breeze, and its dark eyes looked straight ahead with quiet dignity. The second horse flicked its tail and settled into stillness once more. Their discipline matched the men holding their reins, a harmony between soldier and animal that spoke louder than words ever could. The tourists looked around, realizing that every phone in the crowd was still pointed at them. They wanted to disappear. What had started as a game for attention had become a stage they could not control. Their embarrassment was now recorded on countless devices. Later, when those videos spread, the laughter would not be theirs. It would belong to millions of strangers watching from around the world, strangers who would shake their heads and say, they should have known better. The guards did not linger. With perfect rhythm, they stepped back into formation, their boots striking the stones in sync. They returned to their posts as though nothing had happened, their eyes never breaking focus. To them, this was part of the job, maintaining respect, ensuring order. There was no drama, no fuss, just duty performed with quiet strength. For the crowd, however, it was unforgettable. Parents leaned down to explain to their children why the guards had acted. Some tourists whispered to each other about how dangerous the situation could have been if the horse had reacted more strongly. Others spoke about the beauty of discipline, how even in the face of mockery the guards never lost their control. People admired the quiet power they had witnessed, and many felt proud to have seen the tradition of the Royal Guard upheld with such dignity. The group of tourists stood off to the side, faces red, avoiding eye contact with anyone around them. Their earlier energy had vanished completely. They no longer wanted the spotlight. They wanted to slip back into the crowd and be forgotten. But the crowd didn't forget so easily. Every whisper, every shake of the head reminded them that their behavior had been seen for what it was: disrespect. No excuses, no defense. Just a clear mistake played out in front of hundreds of witnesses. As the minutes passed, the tension slowly eased. The horses stood still. The guards remained like statues, and the respectful silence returned to the square. The tourists were quiet now, their phones tucked away, their bravado gone. The atmosphere felt balanced again. The palace grounds carried their usual calm, filled with the sense of history and tradition that draws millions of visitors each year. Yet for those who had seen what happened, the memory stayed sharp. They had witnessed not just a warning, but a lesson. It was a reminder that Buckingham Palace is not a playground. It is a place of honor. The guards may not speak often, but when they do, their words carry the full weight of centuries of discipline. The horses may appear calm, but their strength is unmatched and they are not to be treated like props for entertainment. The crowd slowly shifted back to normal sightseeing. Cameras clicked again, but this time with respect. Families posed for pictures a safe distance from the guards, smiling proudly instead of mocking. Children pointed at the horses with wide eyes, asking questions about their training. And parents answered softly, reminding them to always stay behind the rope. The lesson had spread beyond the group of foolish tourists. It had touched everyone who had watched. Meanwhile, the embarrassed tourists tried to disappear into the background. They whispered to each other nervously, some blaming one another, others insisting it wasn't a big deal. But deep inside, they all knew it was. They had been humbled. They had been reminded that rules are not optional and respect is not a joke. The day continued, but the moment stayed alive in the air. For the guards, it was just another day of duty. For the horses, it was just another shift of discipline. But for the tourists and the crowd, it was a story that would be retold again and again. A story about what happens when arrogance meets discipline, when mockery meets dignity. And most importantly, a story about why respect matters, even in the smallest of actions. Word of the scene outside Buckingham Palace did not stay within the stone walls and the square. By the evening, the video clips had already spread across social media platforms. The sound of the horses' stomp, the guards' sharp command, and the nervous laughter of the tourists were now playing on thousands of screens. What began as a careless act by a small group had turned into a global lesson in respect. People from different countries commented, some in shock, others in admiration. The guards had not raised their voices in anger, and the horses had not acted wildly, yet the message was stronger than if they had. Discipline spoke louder than any argument ever could. The tourists themselves had wanted attention, and now they had it, but not the way they had hoped. Their faces were everywhere, their careless actions replayed frame by frame. Strangers online shook their heads, calling it a lack of respect, a failure to understand the seriousness of tradition. Some even pointed out how lucky they were that the horses had shown restraint. "Those are powerful animals," one comment read. "They could have been hurt." Another person wrote, "This is why you don't treat soldiers like clowns. They're doing their duty." Across different platforms, the story became a warning. When you visit a place of honor, you carry responsibility with you. Back at the palace, life returned to its usual rhythm. The guards stood tall, unshaken by the earlier disruption. For them, it was another day at work. Their training had prepared them for moments like these. Their duty was not to react emotionally, but to maintain dignity and order. The horses, too, settled back into their calm posture, ears flicking only slightly at the constant hum of tourists around them. The palace gates gleamed under the afternoon sun, and visitors once again lined up respectfully behind the ropes. It was as if the place itself demanded calm and reverence, and after the incident, everyone seemed more aware of that truth. For the crowd who had witnessed the event in person, the story stayed alive in their minds. Families spoke about it as they walked away, telling their children to remember the lesson: respect the guards, respect the animals, respect the history. Some tourists admitted to each other that at first they had thought the group's antics were funny, but when the horses reacted, they realized how wrong it was. Many even said they would retell the story when they returned home, a reminder to friends and family not to treat Buckingham Palace like a playground. What the foolish group had done in a few minutes had created a lesson that stretched far beyond themselves. The tourists who had mocked the guards now felt the weight of embarrassment. They kept their heads down as they left the square, trying to avoid the stares of those still watching. They whispered nervously, some blaming each other, others insisting it wasn't that serious. But deep inside, they knew it was. They had not just embarrassed themselves, they had shown the world how arrogance could strip dignity away in seconds. Every time they thought about the horse stomping its hooves or the guard's commanding voice, they felt a sting of regret. And they knew that no matter how much they tried to forget, the internet would not let them. For the guards, the moment proved something important too. Their discipline was their greatest strength. They did not need to argue, they did not need to break their silence. They simply stood firm, And the truth revealed itself. The respect they commanded did not come from words. It came from centuries of tradition, uniform, posture, and honor. And for the horses, their natural strength and calmness reminded everyone that animals too deserve respect. They were not props for tourists. They were living creatures, trained to serve in royal ceremonies, carrying centuries of history on their strong shoulders. As the video spread further, news channels picked them up. Headlines read, "Tourists mock Royal Guard, quickly regret it, and horses and guards show why respect matters." Morning talk shows replayed the clips, some adding light commentary, others discussing the importance of teaching visitors proper conduct at historic sites. Teachers in schools even showed the video as a reminder to students about manners and respect when traveling. The incident that had begun as a careless joke had become a global classroom. In the days that followed, many visitors to Buckingham Palace were more cautious. They kept their distance, listened carefully to instructions, and admired the guards with quiet respect. Parents told their children, "Do not be like those people in the video." Even tour guides adjusted their talks, adding reminders about the seriousness of the guards' role. The foolish group had wanted to create entertainment for themselves, but instead they had created a lasting reminder that rules are there for a reason. The tourists may have thought they were the main characters of their day, but in truth, they became a side note in the long story of Buckingham Palace. The real focus remained the guards and the horses, the symbols of tradition, discipline, and respect. Their silent strength had spoken louder than laughter, and their presence had reminded the world that some things are not to be mocked. The palace had stood for centuries, watching generations come and go, and it would continue to stand long after this group was forgotten. But the lesson they left behind would remain. For those who had been in the square that morning, it became a personal memory they would never forget. Some would later tell the story with a smile, others with a shake of the head, but all would remember the same truth. You cannot mock dignity and expect nothing to happen. The tourists had wanted a story for themselves, but instead they gave a story to everyone else. A story that spread across the world. A story that reminded millions why respect matters, no matter where you are or who you think you are. By the end of the week, the incident had already taken on a life of its own. Memes were created, jokes were shared, but at the heart of it all was a clear message. Respect is not optional. The guards and the horses did not need to raise a hand or lose their composure. Their silent power was enough, and for those who thought tradition was just for show, they learned that tradition lives on because it demands respect. The foolish laughter of a few had been silenced by the stomp of hooves and the command of a soldier. The quiet clapping of the crowd had replaced their noise, and in that shift, a timeless lesson was taught once again. Honor deserves honor, and respect will always stand taller than arrogance.